So, whew, I'm not completely done as to the situation of the word, because obviously the word is a very modern dance, and what eventually became the modern thought and modern way of dressing, which then initially evolved from the ways of dressing in Western Europe, starting in the early to mid 18th centuries. Well, that was already the case in the 1890s, and one may see a lot of photographs of people from different races in completely different areas, like in Africa, Negro persons there, dressed more or less like an Englishman and so on and all. But obviously, what one has to realize is nowadays the population is 8 to 9 billion. Back then it was not even 2 billion. The white race, or specifically what we call the white race, which does not count all white people, because some white people, in other words, albinos, are not the same race, are not the same, like we take the Japanese to look different, although to have the same skin color. The white race, so these are the, forget the color, but the phenotype. How many races are there? Well, it's just 3 main races, or breeds if you want to call them: Mongoloid, Negroid, and Dravidian. Dravidian is like me. All of those races also have albinos, but most albinos, the big albino race, is really what we call the white race, which is the Dravidian albinos. Most Dravidians are not albinos, and they inhabit places such as like the Romanovs, the Gypsies, or places such as India, especially the southern parts, even in Latin countries. Today the Dravidian albinos, in other words white people like me, do not even make up 1 billion persons. If you count all of them, even those few scattered ones in Africa and the Middle East and wherever they may be from, they're barely 1 billion. They're like 800 million. Back then the same ratio applied. So they would have been, I don't want to convert it, but just convert it on barely 2 billion people. How many were they? A lot of those persons were not dressed like that for the reasons explained, because most of those people were peasants. Most of those countries were in Europe, but still most of those countries, first of all, they only really dressed like that in Europe, especially Western Europe, not really the eastern parts. And only a few of those Western European countries then, and even counting America, even then only a few individuals in terms of population actually dressed like that, because most people there were peasants. Except when you really go to countries like Britain and United States, northern parts of the United States, where most people, although they were workers, they would work in factory and so expected to at least show up in the suit, even if they can take off the coat and all. So in other words, looking for that type of clothing, that was not, people said, as the majority of clothing. No, it was the majority of clothing really just for the Western Europe plus United States. But then not even the majority of clothing, because most of those countries actually worked on peasants, unlike the northern parts of the United States and Britain. So then only a few actually had suits. Now if you want upper class, the upper classes represented nothing. So the upper classes basically had the same type of garment, but just better made. So the working classes, when they were not peasants, they were trying to copy the upper classes. In other words, if they could have worn the same thing, they would have worn the same thing. A lot of peasants were actually middle class. Some peasants were middle class and so could emulate, like even better than what the cheap workers of the factories would have done, but they would not do it because they were peasants and did not give a damn about the actual city upper class, or because peasants did not have an upper class, they only had like a middle class max, and upper middle class, and the only peasants you would have seen in suits more or less every day, not just on Sunday, would have been the peasants, or at least in similar suits, would have been the peasants, which were upper middle class, and very few of them were. And again, only those that actually give a damn about emulating what the city people did. Or in other words, what the actual upper class, which only belonged to cities, did. And thus, a lot of them still had, like, you can check Hitler, or in Germany, because Hitler is fine because you have a lot of photographs from him, and it's even later on. but in countries like what used to be the Holy Roman Empire, so in other words, what then already by the 1890s were split into Germany, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Hungary, Austria, and Austrian Germany, I think, which back then was a separate country from Austria and Germany, I don't know, and maybe the state of Bavaria, and even to some extent Bohemia, which starts being really Eastern Europe, Bohemia, and then I think the whole the ex-Holy Roman Empire also had what today are the Benelux countries, in other words, Belgium, Holland, I think there's another one, no, Belgium, Holland, that is it. Yes, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and then Switzerland is on its own. So then all those countries had a more or less similar culture of the mountains and all. And even until the 1920s, 40s, a lot of people still wore suits. But again, because there were a lot of peasants and a lot of people were still peasants, they would wear suits with like the German suits. German suits of the cities are practically undifferentiable from British suits of the cities, like British suits. Only experts like I, when upon analysis of the constructions, can tell if it's a German suit. But otherwise, most people wore a suit that was like those German styles, like they would still wear knickerbockers or even shorts, and then these leather braces, and then they would have like patterns embroidered in leather wool on top of the jacket, and the buttoning waistcoat would button higher up and have a standing up collar and maybe a standing up collar upon the coat. So they looked far different to suits that you think of like Sherlock Holmes wearing and stuff, the stuff I wear. So, and that was quite the case until most of the population in those countries rarely stopped being peasants, even if upper middle class peasants, and rarely, even if they were still working class, became a city, urban working class that had lost its peasant culture, in other words, with the embroidering and all. As I say, there are photographs of Hitler until even the 1930s, because initially it was brought up really as a peasant going to be like his father was a civil servant, but had grown up in a peasant family. So he is a great example because you get it. I will not start talking and going off track, but you get it. So, and the same situation to some extent was in France, but the French were more like the British in the sense that they were more caste-like, in the sense that a situation like Hitler being half peasant, half almost city man, and his father being the same, did not exist as much in France. It was really more either you are a peasant or you are an urban folk, so either rural or urban. And even until today, it's to some degree that is that, except that today there's more peasantry, but today it will be more like either you are farmer or urban. So, as soon as they would not really be in between, they did not really have in between sorts that much. If they started when they would get to the city to find work, they would really dress differently, or at least they would still wear their peasant stuff until it wore out, and then they would just replace it with city wear that they would get from the cities, which was really inspired to completely copied by the fashions set by the British monarchs, which were the fashion bearers of the day, and thus by Savile Row, because they got dressed in Savile Row and Soho. So everyone, even in England, tried to copy Savile Row and Soho. So even in the north of England, they would apply local techniques to do the same patterns and designs. So even if the sewing was different, the same patterns and designs and details would be then on the fashion bearers, fashion creators of Savile Row and Soho. And the further one got away from them, the more obviously it looked less alike, and the more the sewing techniques and patterns and all differed. Also, the more the weather was different, the more it had to be adapted so people would not suffocate, or vice versa, would not die of cold like in Russia or Scandinavia, where the weather is invariably colder than in Britain. So one gets the idea. Usually, as I explained, most French antiques from that era, in other words 1840 to 1920, that have survived, are usually from the northern half of France, even maybe more from the northern parts of France. In other words, they copied British styles a lot, but upon touching it, one shall notice there are much less interlinings, because they're also inspired by Italian turning and